Alright, in this chapter, we are going to go over some basic terminology. We're going to define communication and health communication. We're going to talk about the perceptual process of communication and identify key principles of information processing theory. So let's go ahead and get right into it. How we perceive and use messages to make a common meaning is basically what communication means. Meanings do change according to context, according to culture, and according to the channel that we use. And response is how we know that the message was understood as it was intended. That is what is necessary for actual communication to take place. So, your book starts off with an example that we can all relate to. Going to a restaurant drive-through, and giving the person on the other end your order, and you're usually speaking to them through some type of electronic box, if you will. Sometimes there are technical difficulties. Quite often there are technical difficulties. And you give your order and you repeat it, and then you get your order and there's something wrong with it. So what has happened in the communication process? Well, we're going to talk about communication as a transaction, and you can think of it as you would a fast food order transaction. So what happens in the process? So the transactional model of communication starts with the sender. So if you're the one making the order at the window, you are the sender of the information. You put in your words, symbols, or gestures, and this is called the encoding. You are encoding the message. You're doing this through some sort of channel. In this instance, this example, you would be doing it verbally, and you would be doing it most likely, but not always, through an electronic device. But you could talk about verbally giving it to a person one-on-one. You could encode it, and the channel could be a telephone, it could be a computer with an email. All of those would be different channels. The person on the other end, the receiver, is the individual who does the decoding. So you're the sender, you're encoding the message. The receiver is the person who's decoding the message. But between the encoding and the decoding, between the sender and the receiver, there's going to be noise, distortion, distraction, and that can look lots of different ways. It can be the sound of a train out your window. It could be a call dropping. It could be static, a short in a wire that affects the drive-through technology. It can be all sorts of things that we refer to as noise, and that's just, again, any type of distraction. So communication is the transfer of the symbolic information within a common symbol system. And for a symbol to be understood, people need to share those common understandings, the symbols that we use. And in this English would be that common symbol. The definition of words, the language, hand symbols, slang or colloquial words or terminologies, all of those things. Your book uses the example of writing in all caps. I take writing as all caps, and many of you do too, probably, as being yelled at. But everyone doesn't share that same understanding. So, the semantic triangle, and this is in your textbook as well as in this PowerPoint, just gives you a graphic example of how misunderstanding can take place. So, the word Mustang, the concept, Mustang. One person may be intending that to mean the vehicle. One person may be picturing a horse. And so when I said the word Mustang, some of you thought one, some of you thought the other. That's just an example of how we have to share the same understanding of symbols. All right, moving on to perceptual process and attribution theory. So you've all probably heard the term perception is reality, and it really is. Our perception, your perception, anyone's individual perception is their reality. Whether or not that's a shared reality is the question. And that is what is necessary for real communication to take place. We do not see things as they are. We see them as we are. That's a great quotation from this section of your book. So, mood is one of the factors that influence our ability to use our senses to take in information. Figure 2.2 in your book illustrates the perceptual process and the factors that operate to shape or, in many cases, to distort our perception. And our perceptions are all influenced by our attitudes, our own motivations, our life experiences. However, characteristics of the object that we perceive or the context of the situation also influence our perception. Attribution theory, which is the next part of this, and it was developed by Viner, posits that when an individual observes an event or a behavior, the thought process is something like this, and this is straight from your textbook if you want to follow along. Was what I just saw intentional? Y'all can all think about this. Some of you I know will relate to this. Like, did the person just mean to do that? Was that just in my head? Am I assigning motives to them that aren't there? Or is it caused by something internal to the individual or external to the individual? So, Viner classified the mental calculations that we make like this. Distinctiveness. Does this person behave in this way in other situations? Second, consensus. Do other people behave in this same manner? And finally, consistency. Does this person behave in the same manner at other times? So sometimes it may be in our head and sometimes it doesn't. So we have to ask ourselves those questions. So if you decide that the person only smokes when other people are smoking, you may decide that the smoking was intentional but externally motivated or externally attributed. meaning it was the specific incident, the context that contributed to your friend smoking. If, though, you've seen your friend smoking in other environments, then the smoking is intentional but internally attributed, meaning it's something that the person does all the time and is not being caused by the situation or the external factor. All right, let's move on to cognitive dissonance. This is something that you may have learned about in other theory courses. So cognitive dissonance, uh, it's a concept established by Leon Festinger, and essentially it means humans tolerate inconsistencies poorly, that we feel most comfortable when cognition and behavior are in harmony, and when there is misalignment of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, we become very uncomfortable or we experience cognitive dissonance. So for using the example that we just used with smoking, your friend may experience cognitive dissonance if he likes to smoke, but he knows that smoking is bad for him. So to reduce this dissonance, he can either change his attitude about smoking or he can change his behavior. Next, we're going to move on to information processing theory. And a lot of these theories, I hope you're like me and you'll find theories are quite interesting to study. So, we as human beings are limited in how much information we can take in at one time. From birth, we start associating words or sounds with meaning, and throughout our lives, millions and millions of little pieces of new information are coming at us every single day. Sights, sounds, smells, textures. We either choose to learn and recognize that information or ignore it. So by the time we become adults, we have literally been shaped and reshaped by all kinds of stimuli. Um, and these things make up our knowledge, our beliefs, our attitudes towards our environment. And it's thousands upon thousands of words and numbers and other pieces of information that we're exposed to really every single day. So our brain is basically on information overload, and we have to find ways to simplify and process all the information. When we are faced with a problem, we tend to focus, especially on a complex problem, we tend to focus on one piece of information at a time. So some of the heuristics that, or I should say, some of the um, heuristics involved include selective perception, and there's so many here. I'll just go over each individually. That's probably the best way to do it. In fact, let me make sure I don't need to switch the slide, because as I told you before, sometimes I forget to switch the slide. So no, we're not ready to switch the slide yet. So we're still on information processing theory. So some of the heuristics include the following: selective perception. This is interpretation of what we see based on our own interests and attitudes. The halo effect is a general impression about someone based on a single characteristic. The contrast effect is a comparative evaluation of a person, object, or characteristic as better or worse than your own. Projection, and I think sometimes we all are guilty of this one too, attribution of our own characteristics to others. We're projecting something on someone else. Representativeness, how much a new perception resembles something that we've seen before. And again, this is based on our own limited set of characteristics. Stereotyping, this is a form of representativeness based on our perception of the group to which someone belongs. Availability, the use of only readily available information in order to make a decision. Anchoring and adjustment. In quantitative situations, people will start with a ballpark figure and then adjust up or down to reach an estimate. In this way, heuristics may help us, but they can also lead us to make very poor decisions. And then finally, the elaboration likelihood model, usually shortened as ELM. It suggests that if you already engaged in an issue, that you're going to pay more attention to it and learn more new information about it. Appealing, I'm looking to make sure that I don't give you insufficient information on this one. So, the example. So, women who are hoping to get pregnant will pay a lot of attention to information about pregnancy or baby care, whereas women who are not interested in getting pregnant or who don't have a baby are not necessarily affected by that information or those ads at all. So, in other words, if we are not already engaged or interested in an issue, there has to be other stimuli to grab our attention. And this can be done in lots of ways. One of the ways that that's done is by using attractive or charismatic spokespeople to grab your attention. The model developed by Petty and Cacioppo suggests there are two routes by which we process and are persuaded by information: the central route and the peripheral route. So in the central route, we are actively engaged in the topic and we think about or elaborate very carefully. In the peripheral route, we may be less engaged in the topic, or we may not be engaged in it at all, but other cues, as I mentioned before, a specifically famous spokesperson, a celebrity, or sounds, for example, may be necessary to get our attention and persuade us to listen to the position or find out the merits of the position. In the peripheral route, the cues may have no logical connection to the subject matter. They just help form an emotional connection. The ELM suggests that most people will read pamphlets that their doctors give them if they've been diagnosed with a disease, but will throw them away if they don't feel they pertain to them. And so this is why sometimes there's got to be another way to garner people's attention. This is just a graphic illustration of what we just went over. So, communicating about health. Remember that our health is affected by lots of different things, including our physical environment, the limiting and enabling factors in our society, as well as our own behavior and choices and our biology. In addition, our physical condition and behavior affect the health and social welfare of others, and we affect the physical environment as well. This is called the ecological model. I'm kind of getting a little bit out of order in the textbook, and so let me back up just a little bit and say that practitioners of health communication use what we know about strategic communication to engage people in thinking about their health, to inform them about healthier choices, and to persuade them to adopt some of those healthier choices. Health communication functions on several different levels, and we'll talk about those throughout. First, on the individual level, effective health communication helps raise a person's awareness of their health risks and how to address those and overcome them if possible. It helps provide motivation and skills, and it helps link a person to a network of support and create or strengthen positive attitudes. This is often done in a patient healthcare provider situation. Health communication also functions on the group level by taking advantage of social groupings, church congregations, a nail salon, gym that you belong to, schools, your company, social media groups, all different sorts of group settings. The dynamics of group message sharing can help to both share but also reinforce positive behaviors and help this be particularly effective. And I'll use an example in my own life. So I have ulcerative colitis, and I've had it for 25 years or so now. Well, we didn't have social media 25 years ago, but in the last decade or so, more and more social media groups have formed around health conditions and sharing things that have worked or foods that have been triggers for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Usually those two are grouped together. And I've shared things that have worked for me, but in turn I've also learned a lot of things. Whenever I've had a flare, I'm able to go to a group of people who share my same health struggles and really learn a lot, but also be supported by others who are going through some of the same things. Health communication functions on the community level, and effective health communication can influence policy and public opinion to make better choices, make positive changes in the physical environment, and also increase the availability of healthy choices in the marketplace. Think about something that you perhaps purchase that maybe 10 years ago you struggled to find, and now more and more companies are realizing, hey, people are really buying into this healthier eating. People are really buying into this alternatives to meat. I'll use that example because I noticed, 20 years ago, you might be able to find tofu. You might not even be able to find tofu in a community like we live in, but now there's more and more alternatives to meat being the staple of your meal, for example. And then health communication functions on the societal level. Health communication helps create new norms for behavior and standards of quality that affect population. Laws that eliminated indoor smoking. When I was growing up, there was a smoking section and a non-smoking section. Or department stores would actually have ashtrays at the cash register. Well, think about how much that has changed. Now, if we were to go in a store and see someone smoking, it's an absurd thing to even think about because our new norm doesn't allow for that. Car seats, using car seats, totally normal now. Seat belts, totally normal now. When I was growing up, back seats often didn't even have car seats in them. And so those are some of the different levels that health communication is very important and central to. This is a table, and you can see more examples that I just mentioned. It's also in your textbook. So communicating about health using the ecological model. I think I mentioned this out of order a couple of minutes ago, so I'll go back over it again. Our health is affected by our physical environment, limiting or enabling factors created by our society as well as our own behavior and biology. And so reciprocally, our physical condition and behavior also affect the health and social welfare of others. And this is what we call the ecological model. A good example of this is how communities have addressed the problem of smoking through a combination of things: taxes on cigarettes, national advertising, workplace cessation, community-based interventions, and the availability of medical cessation products. All have been a factor in the ecological approach to health communication. Obviously, communication can't do this alone, but it's definitely a help. A poor social environment, limited resources, and poverty are all still a factor. Health communication's definitely not the only answer, but it's very important. Our responsibilities run deeper than we think. Individuals need access to the information to protect and better their health. And so health communication is definitely a key part of solving the problem. So, challenges to effective health communication. Designing information that is clear, compelling, actionable, and available to all who need it. That is what effective health communication is, and it is incredibly difficult to uh, get from start to finish to make sure that people are receiving the information and then acting on it. Here's some of the things that help. Creating multiple versions of messages and materials. Many of the people who are at risk for a particular health condition may access information in different ways through different channels. For example, the elderly may not be as technologically savvy as a younger person. Immigrants whose first language isn't English may need to access the information in a different way. People with disabilities may have physical barriers from coming physically to a place to get information or help. All of those things have to be addressed in the health communication process. Other things, culture and belief systems can affect it. We talked about sharing common symbol systems. It's very important. And some people are just not motivated to seek out health information, or they specifically ignore it when it is presented to them. And so, in this way, a health communicator has to know that, okay, this is something that's got to be addressed at either the community or the group level in order to change the norms and attitudes. Additionally, a growing challenge is just the sheer number of information sources or channels, from traditional media to a limitless number of internet, social media, apps. People are inundated with almost too much information or too much noise, and so that's also a problem. Oops. Trying to make sure that I don't switch the slide too soon. So, what are some of the other risk comparisons? So, risk perception is this we're all trying to gain information, but we also need to realize that individuals may not have an accurate depiction of what their risk is. So we use risk comparisons in health for patients to evaluate the relative value of different choices or different procedures to explain whether or not they're likely to get this chronic illness, or what is the danger of this particular environmental contaminant in your neighborhood. Or you can even use the likelihood of gaining or getting COVID back when we were all worried about getting COVID and dying back in 2020. What is our risk perception? If you look at box 2.4 in your chapter, it defines hazard, risk, exposure, and toxicity from the U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So, when we as individuals consider our risk of contracting things, we often, depending on what we have been exposed to, what messages we've been exposed to, greatly overestimate our risk. And that what it's going to take to address that risk or what it's going to take to intervene. However, there are cases where we greatly underestimate our risk and the substantial impact something that can have on our health as well. And so the examples that your textbook uses is getting the flu. Most people greatly underestimate their risk of getting the flu, or if they get it, they don't think it's going to be a big deal. But the CDC estimates that between 10 and 35 million people get the flu every single year, and 200,000 have to go to the hospital, and upwards of 50,000 people die every year of the flu. But many of us don't get vaccinated. I do. For one, I get vaccinated every year. But even less children get vaccinated than adults, and it can be deadly to any of us. So what does that say about the public at large? The public at large don't really look at statistics or probabilities. They really pay more attention to media, social media, what their friends are telling them, what members of their community are experiencing. This is table 2.2. From page 32 in your textbook. And then continuing on some of the challenges to effective health communication. Yeah, again, I've talked a lot about this while I was going through the other slide. I apologize, I don't always remember to switch them. Positive self-opinion or optimism bias is not recognizing you or your community in a realistic way. But the more we know about risk, it's interesting, the more, or excuse me, the less likely we believe that it's going to happen to us. Peter Sandman, who is a specialist in risk perception, says that the risks that kill you are not necessarily the risks that anger and frighten you. Fear is a basic human emotion, and it's grounded in a biological necessity to protect ourselves from danger. And what this means is that if a risk occurs that we do not know a lot about, and about which we're likely to feel outrage, our perception of that risk is higher because we are fearful, even if our actual risk is very low. And a lot of this, honestly, being in the media for so long, has to do with how much we've engaged with information about the risk, the illness, whatever it is. The more information we take in that is negative about it, the more fearful we may be of it. Your chapter talks about the COVID. I've got COVID on the mind. The Ebola outbreak in 2014, where people still talk about the Ebola outbreak, but most of the contaminations happened in very rural areas in Africa. Only 4 people in America were infected, and yet we were all fearful of contracting Ebola. This is figure 2.7 that basically just graphically depicts what I was just talking about. So, public estimations of hazards and risks. Why do we tend to underestimate or overestimate our risks? And there's several reasons for this. So, first, voluntary or chosen. This is a risk that we choose to take, and the risks that we choose to take ourselves make them seem less hazardous than one that is imposed upon us. So, if you choose to text and drive, you think that it is far less risky than in reality it actually is, because you've chosen to participate in that. Second, natural. If a hazard comes from a natural event, we think it's less likely to hurt us. So compare the radiation we're exposed to from the sun versus the radiation we're exposed to from a cell phone. Third, if it's known, risks that are known and that we have experience with, we aren't as likely to be concerned about as more exotic risks. As I mentioned previously, very few of us worry about getting the flu compared to Ebola, because we're familiar with the flu, it's well known to us. Ebola, almost none of us have any connection to Ebola or anyone who's ever had it. Next, trusted. The more confidence we have in those who are responsible for protecting us, the less worried we are about its effect on us. Controlled. The more we think that the response to the risk is under control, the less we feel at risk. And so those are the reasons we tend to underestimate our risks. On the other hand, there are times when we overestimate the risks, and these are characteristics of the following. First, dread. What is something that really frightens you? I love the example in the book, being eaten by a shark or dying of heart disease. So your risk of being bitten by a shark is 1 in nearly 4 million, and your risk of dying of heart disease is 1 in 4. But typically the most feared deaths are the ones that worry us the most, despite very, very little chance of it happening. The second is childhood impact. The survival of the species depends on the survival of its offspring, its children. And so risks to children appear to be more serious than the same risk to adults. For example, if we find asbestos in the walls of a school, people get far more outraged than finding asbestos in a workplace. Next, personal impact. Any risks can seem greater to us if we or others who are close to us are victims. So if you have a close friend who's had breast cancer, for example, or a specific type of cancer, you may think that your risk of contracting that is higher, despite there's no evidence to that case. That may be why you overestimate. And then previous exposure. When we remember a previous risk, the future risk is easier for us to imagine that it's greater. Having a house that burned down, you may fear that you have a much higher risk of it happening again because it's already happened to you. Rarity. Really unusual events are perceived as riskier than more commonplace ones. Unusual events are usually more fear-producing than everyday occurrences, even though our chances of those everyday occurrences happening are far higher. For example, a car accident. We're much more worried about some really bizarre thing than something that happens to people every day. And then lastly, fairness. People who feel that they are at higher risk because of who they are or where they live may believe that things are not fair. The book uses the example of if a chemical plant is in a poor neighborhood, residents may feel they're at higher risk of developing cancer, even when no evidence supports that fear.